Peeps! It's the World War II lecture. Ooh. Here's the thing. You'll notice we haven't done a lot of wars in this class. That we skipped over the War of 1812, the French and Indian War that was before the Revolution, World War One. I don't like the kind of history where you just go from war to war to war and call that history as if that tells you anything meaningful. But World War II is worth slowing down and looking at because for the United States, it really is a world war. That is, if you were in England, you were fighting in Europe. If you were in Japan, you were fighting in the Pacific. But if you were in the United States, you were fighting in both places. So for us, it really was a world war. Whereas World War I, for example, for the United States, we got in really late. Like we fought the last 18 months of that war. And it wasn't a world war. They were fighting in Europe. It's only a world war if you count that there was some fighting in North Africa, but that's not the whole world either. So World War II is, as far as I'm concerned, the first and only real world war. And I think a lot of historians would agree with me. Usually in history, we start with dates. The official dates for World War II for most of the combatants is 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, to 1945, when and early in the year Germany collapsed and surrendered, and later in the year the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan, the only nation to ever drop atomic bombs on another nation, and thus forced Japan to surrender. But that's deceptive because those aren't the dates of the war for the United States, and they aren't the dates of the war for other places. For example, for my Chinese and Chinese American students, the war for them began in 1937. The Chinese and the Japanese have been on loggerheads. Japanese behaved, and the Chinese are still pretty angry about this, and that's fairly fair. The Japanese acted very badly in China well before 1941. In 1937, they invaded and then engaged almost immediately in the rape, or it's sometimes called the Rape of Nanking, sometimes the Nanking Massacre. It's a pretty awful thing. So China's at war in as early as 1937. Italy invaded Ethiopia, which is in North Africa, in 1935. So for North Africa, the war begins in 1935. For the United States of America, officially the war began when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. But we don't really get to it. Like you declare war and then have to ramp things up. So we don't really go to war until 1942. And you're thinking, I don't care about these dates, Peg. Dates is what makes me hate history. And yeah, I get you. I feel you. Numbers. But my point is about this is because this is a world war, different places have different experiences of that war. And the United States history of that war is not the only history of that war. That makes sense? Is that fair? I think so. The statistics. I had the depressing statistics in that title thing there, and I took out the word depressing because I thought, I don't need to tell you how to feel. But then I just told you. Anyway, 100 million people from 30 countries fought in the war. Peg, more numbers! Yeah, but sometimes numbers can tell us the scope of things. I don't expect you to memorize these numbers and regurgitate them in some hideous, multiple guess test. I don't. But I'm trying to get you a sense that the numbers are big because the scale of the war was big. 100 million people fought in the war. The war had worldwide 50 million combat fatalities. That's combat fatalities. So that you can bet that the fatalities from non-combat, that is people who got sick, enlisted. My Uncle Edward enlisted and died of pneumonia on a ship on the way to the Pacific. He's a fatality of World War II because he wouldn't have died if he hadn't been on that ship, but he's not a combat fatality. So you have many more millions of fatalities like that, and then you have 11 million dead in the Nazi genocide. The number for the genocide is usually given as 6 million. That's 6 million Jews the Nazis exterminated in World War II, but they also killed people of color, developmentally delayed people, people with mental illness, um, gypsies, Armenians. They had a death machine, and they eradicated a bunch of people in their camps. And I think it's worth keeping in mind that Nazi genocide is about fascism, and fascism is about authoritarianism, and it's dangerous. And we're seeing a resurgence of it in the United States and America in the last decade, and these days headed up particularly by the rapist ex-president. Shit's dangerous. People die. The combatants. We usually call this. It's like the sides. Say it's the teams. It's the Dodgers and the Yankees. Um, the Allies, and that's because this is the United States history. So of course for us the Allies would be the people on our side, and then the Axis, the people on the other side. In the main, the Allies for us is the United States, Britain, China, and then Soviet Union, to a lesser extent Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Belgium, and some other small countries. And some countries were just like, we're not going to actually fight in the war, but we offer our support, and we're not going to fight for the other side. That's a kind of ally too, and that's important stuff too. The Axis, that is the enemy, at least from the United States perspective, and from a moral perspective, maybe as well. Germany, Japan, and Italy are your big players, and to a lesser extent, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania, which are in Eastern Europe. Yeah? Let's go look at the map. Here we go. Just because I know some of you, it's helpful to see things. We have people who learn with words. I learn with words. That's why there's so many words in these lectures. But I try and put pictures in because I know a lot of people. Pretty much everybody in my immediate family is a visual learner. They need to see things. And a lot of my students are as well. We got a fancy color-coded map here. The Allies before Pearl Harbor, so from 38 to 42, that's in green. Remember, see, most of Africa's in green. And again, it's not so much that all those African nations sent militaries to the war, but rather pledged to be on the Ally side and not fight on the other side, and then mostly just stayed out of it. But you have England and France there in the middle of Europe. Spain's the little niblet hanging out there, and they stayed neutral, as did that tiny little, that's Ireland up there by England. We don't need to run all the countries. I in no way expect you to memorize these. Russia's in red because it's started out on one side. It started on the Nazi side and then switched sides during the war. The Russians, gotta love them. Switched to the Ally side. We're in blue. South Africa's in blue too, and technically was in the war, but it's much like Africa, not a lot. China also. China joins England and France in the war, but China is busy fighting Japan. So you don't get any Chinese troops in Europe. They got their hands full with Japan. Anyway, I don't want to break down the whole map. You get a sense. There were teams. Some people switched teams. Some people were on a team but sat on the bench, etc., etc. The thing about this war, this world war, is it's a world war because it's really two simultaneous wars. And I think it's really deceptive. We call it World War II. But it's really what's happening is you have one war going on about one set of things in one place and a whole nother war going on in another place about a different set of things. The only thing they have in common is sort of a notion that imperialism, for Germans, we will be imperialists. We want to take over the entirety of Europe. And for Japan, we are imperialists. We want to take over the entirety of Asia. That's what they have in common. But really, it's helpful to think of these as two wars. The first is the European War. That's a classic two-front war in our map here. That sort of lavender thing in the middle, that's Germany and Italy. The pink thing next to it is France. And so what happens is, see Germany and Italy in the middle, you have a two-front war. So you have fighting on the French side, and you're fighting over here on the Eastern European, close to Russia side. Yeah, so that's one of the wars. It's the European War. And again, the issue there is Germany says we'd like to control the entirety of Europe and wipe out everyone not white. and the rest of Europe says, yeah, let's not do that. The other war is the Pacific War. So that's the war that China's fighting in. It's the war to a small extent Russia is fighting in a little bit, but mostly the combatants in that war are Japan on one side and then the United States and China on the other side. And that war, again, it's imperialism. Japan would like to be in charge of the Pacific. Really what they're trying to do is they're trying to move us, the United States of America, out of the Pacific. And again, let's not get too holier than thou about that. Remember the imperialism lecture? The United States saw these Pacific islands as their sphere of influence. But let's be honest, those islands really belong to the people who live there, not to the United States or to Japan. So really what we're doing is scrapping over who controls this immensely lucrative region of the world. Does Japan control it, or does the United States control it? And really, the answer should be the people who live there should control it, because imperialism is shitty, right? Yeah. So there you have it. It's worth saying that a lot more could be said about both of these things, that what you're getting is the short and dirty for me, and that's all right. This is History 1. We're learning a lot of things over a big span of time, and everything we've gotten has been a shorthand, and it's okay. Just keep in mind, there's a lot more that could be said about the European War and the Pacific War, and what I'm doing is giving you a broad and general overview that is, for our purposes, good enough. Yeah? Cool. Okay, at issue for the United States of America is really a couple of things. We got two. What happens is that Japan bombs Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor is in the Hawaii. Hawaii is at the time a U.S. territory. Again, remember the imperialism lecture. And so that's a direct attack on the United States as far as we're concerned. So we declare war on Japan. Germany, for some reason, says, fine, we declare war on the United States. And the United States says, fine, we'll declare war on you. And then England is like, oh, thank God, I'm so relieved, because England really needs our help. They can only do so much against the ferocity and the mindless violence of the Nazis. So what happens is that late in 41, early in 1942, the United States finds itself in two massive wars, two big wars, which is extra big, right? And this requires massive war mobilization. Immediately then, essentially, the Great Depression ends, because mobilization for two massive wars, one in the Pacific and one in Europe, means there's lots of jobs, because you have to build all the things for war. The airplanes, the ships, the uniforms, the boots, the cannon, I was going to say tractors, tanks. I don't know, maybe some tractors too. I don't know. I'm such a farmer. You have to build all that stuff, and then you also have to send men to fight in both of those wars, and some women, but mostly men. That means everybody who wants a job has got a job, either in the military or in a factory making stuff. Plus, you still need to make all the stuff that's made when there's not war. You know, toilet paper, pantyhose, shampoo, that kind of stuff, right? That means everybody has a job that wants a job. And not everybody always wants a job. And some people can't for all sorts of reasons, right? But it essentially means the end of unemployment and a booming wartime economy. War is very good for business. It's why corporate America likes it so much. This doesn't mean because everyone, white, brown, black, male, and female, who wants a job has a job, that suddenly in America sexism and racism are over. And indeed, in this two-part lecture, we're going to find out, wow, nothing could be further from the truth, and really, no surprise there. All right, I'm going to start this lecture by talking about Japanese relocation. I have no desire to do the parade of battles. Then this was fought, and that was fought, and this side won, and that side won. I don't care about military history. I'm not saying it's not important. I know there are people who love military history. My husband is a World War II history dork, by which he means he really, really likes military history, and he's really, really interested in the history of World War II aircraft and tanks. He knows everything about World War II aircraft. I mean everything. And by extension, I have learned some of that stuff too. But fundamentally, at the basis, I don't care. I'm a social historian. It means I care about the people. What was going on with the people? And so we're going to start with Japanese relocation. Here's what happens. Tragic American story. Tragic American misstep. Um, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the guy who brought us the New Deal, the guy whose praises I was singing last week, 1942. So the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in December. 3 months later, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signs into law the Executive Order 9066, which orders the internment of Americans who might be loyal to a foreign hostile government. Here's the thing. For a long time when I gave this lecture, I thought he ordered the internment of people of Japanese descent. But then one time I thought, wouldn't it be fun if we actually looked at the order in class? This is back when History 1 was in a room. I'll get a copy of the executive order. We'll read it in class and we'll talk about it. I got the order online. It's incomprehensible. It's written. You can tell by the way it's written they were trying to hide what they were doing, which tells you they knew it was wrong when they were doing it. And it never says the word Japan or Japanese isn't even in the order. So, but it does say to order the internment, which means round people up and put them in camps of people who might be loyal to a hostile foreign government. Who are the hostile foreign governments? Germany, Italy, and Japan, mostly. But what we don't do is go around rounding up German Americans. My grandma came here from Germany in 1905. She's a German immigrant. They don't go around rounding up Italian immigrants. They just round up not only Japanese immigrants, but Japanese Americans, people who had been here, whose parents came here, who great-grandparents, or grandparents came here, people who were born here. They round up both immigrants, people who came here from Japan and became citizens, and people who were born here and were ipso facto citizens, right? A very small number of German Americans and Italian Americans were interred in a camp up in Montana, I think. Yeah, don't quote me on that. But a very small number. I think it was a camp outside of Missoula, Montana. Almost entirely, 99.8% of the people interned by the Executive Order 9066 were Japanese Americans. Executive Order 9066 is both a result of a sort of rampant anti-Asian sentiment. I have a longer, when I teach, I used to teach a class that was just sort of, it was History 8 at Mount SAC is the Civil War to the present. So you got 15 weeks to do not the whole of American history, but just the last half of it, or even really the last third of it. And in that lecture, I had a whole lecture about anti-Asian racism in American history. But here we have to just, again, quick and dirty. So Executive Order 9066 is playing up on a long history of anti-Asian sentiment. You saw in the video assignment last week that the news guy talking about our history of how we treated people, and that in 1924 we passed a law and said that Asian immigrants couldn't come here anymore. Even they were so hated. And then we get here right after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, a lot of anti-Asian immigrant. And in spite of the fact that Japan bombed America, most Americans, and I don't need to tell the Asian students this, most Americans can't tell the difference between a Japanese person, a Chinese person, a Thai person, or even a Filipino. I'll read this. I know you can read, but it's there. Don't write any of this down. You just get the idea that there was a lot of really gross things said about Japanese Americans and really Asian Americans, because we can't tell the difference. A viper is nonetheless a viper wherever the egg is hatched. Notice comparing Asian people to reptiles. So now we've dehumanized them. So a Japanese American born of Japanese parents, a person who's a citizen, grows up to be Japanese and not an American. This was a sort of notion that you couldn't assimilate Asians, that they were so different that they couldn't be assimilated into American culture, which is freaking ridiculous. But nonetheless. Thus, while it might cause injustice to a few, to treat them all as potential enemies, we are nonetheless at war with their race. This is the LA Times. This isn't like the Ku Klux Klan newsletter. At war with their race. Not at war with the Japanese government. At war with all Japanese people, even the ones who are citizens of the United States. That is some racist shit. And then General John DeWitt, who was in charge of the Western Defense Command, he's in charge of the military group that rounded up Japanese Americans and put them in camps just for being Japanese Americans. The Japanese race is an enemy race. There it is again. See that? By virtue of you being Japanese, you are an enemy. And while many second or third Japanese are born on second or third generation Japanese are born on United States soil, well, of course they are, possessed by United States citizenship and have become Americanized, the racial strains are undiluted. There it is again, the notion that Japanese Americans aren't really Americans. Therefore, it follows along that the Pacific Coast, over 112,000 potential enemies of Japanese extraction, are at large today. That is, that every single person with a drop of Japanese blood in them is ipso facto an enemy. Man, that's some racist shit. Right? Super gross. I think it's super easy in American history to imagine that racism is something that white people do to black people. But it's so much more complicated than that. Yeah. So here's how it goes. And I've got a bunch of slides. I'm going to try and do each one of them fairly quickly so that this doesn't take 37 hours. But here's how it went. First, if you were Japanese or Japanese naturalized Japanese citizen, so somebody was born in Japan, came here and became a citizen, or you were born here, you're second, third, fourth generation Japanese American, didn't matter. You would come home from work one day or school one day, and there would be an order nailed to your door that said, pack your bags. On this day, we will meet at this place, and we will remove you. And you were ordered to leave. And if you weren't leave, the authorities came, the military and the police came and helped you along. And the notion was that everybody in the family could take one bag. So if there was mom and dad and two kids, you could take 4 suitcases. And then you had to leave everything else. I want you to think about that for a second. Look around your bedroom. Look around your house. What do you pack? And then here's the thing about leaving that stuff. No one's going to pay your rent when you're gone. Nobody's going to pay your mortgage while you're gone. So you're going to lose that house. You're going to lose your business. You're going to lose everything in it. And all you're going to have is what you packed in that bag. Fantastic. Only, of course, it's not fantastic. Unless you're a super minimalist. But it's not fantastic. You had to leave everything. And it means that people lost their homes, they lost their businesses, they lost everything except that one bag of things, that one suitcase, and then, of course, their family and their people and their culture, because you can't take that away from people. The sign on the left, that's a really famous sign. It's a Japanese American citizen tried to sell their store, couldn't sell it because people knew you could hold out. These poor Japanese Americans had to go, so they were going to have to sell at rock bottom prices because they had no choice. So you could hold out and then buy the store for practically nothing, or just walk away from it. You could try a sale before you had to go. It's just so awful. So now you've been ordered to pack up and leave everything, and Japanese Americans did. They wanted to prove that they were law-abiding, faithful citizens, that even when they were mistreated, they were still good citizens. They packed up and they reported to their reporting places, and then they were taken to temporary camps. And in Southern California, both the Santa Anita Race Course and the LA County Fairgrounds were used as temporary camps. And indeed, and I used to live in Pomona in the hood, and I lived in the hood. I lived a block above Holt off of Town Avenue. Baby, that was a hood. It was nice. I loved that. I loved that house. Anyway, if you drive down Gary Avenue past the fairgrounds, and you'll see, I haven't driven that way in a while, but I assume they're still there. It looks like stables from the road. These long, low, old wooden buildings. I think they are using them, or they were using them as stables, but they started out their lives as temporary buildings for Japanese internees. You can still see them from the road. From the temporary camps, the notion was that one of the reasons that Japanese Americans were dangerous is that if Japan attacked California, because Japan is in the Pacific Ocean, and that's the Pacific Ocean off the California coast, and because the California coast is got a whole bunch of really important ports that would have been worth attacking, the notion that Japanese Americans in California might signal the Japanese Navy, "Ooh, look, here's Los Angeles, bomb there," or point your missiles at San Pedro or Long Beach, as if the Japanese couldn't find Long Beach harbor without some Japanese person standing on a hill waving a flashlight. The whole notion is ridiculous, but nonetheless, the idea was that you needed to move people inland, away from the ocean, away from where they could collaborate with the potential attacking Japanese. Here's the thing: Japan never did attack the coast of California. There were some small number of subs sighted off the coast of California, tiny bit of military action, nothing worth putting in the history books. And so what you see here, you've got Tula Lake and Manzanar in California, and you're thinking, well, it's still California. But yeah, those are both on the other side of the Sierra Mountains. So the Sierras are pretty big. We used to go fishing. We used to drive up 395 up Bishop in Independence up there. Really pretty country. And Manzanar, if you're ever up that way, they've got a really cool museum there. I don't really like museums because I don't like to walk around and just look at things. I like to touch things. But the Manzanar Museum is really beautifully put together with all sorts of interactive stuff. So for somebody with a tiny 4-year-old squirrel brain like me, it's a fantastic museum. I recommend. Also camps in Idaho, Wyoming, Colorado, Arizona. There's one way over in Arkansas. But moved to these permanent camps, the most famous of which is Manzanar in California. The camps were fairly gruesome. The buildings were slapped up quickly, temporary housing. If you've ever been up the East Sierra, like Manzanar, it gets really cold in the winter. Mount Whitney, the highest peak in California, and that's saying something, is you can stand in Manzanar and see Mount Whitney. It snows there, the wind blows, it's cold. In the summer, it gets really hot because it's California. So people were crowded into these buildings. They were cold in the winter, hot in the summer. They were crowded. There wasn't very much privacy. These camps were surrounded by fences. There were guards with guns. And here these people lived having committed no crime, having been not subject to American justice, just jailed for the crime of being Japanese Americans, which is fundamentally illegal, except for Executive Order 9066, which made it legal. So dangerous to round people up and put them in camps. Like the ex-president who wants to be another president, he says if he gets elected again, he'll round up all the immigrants and put them in camps. Nice, Sweet Pea. Really nice. And the really, really terrible thing about this is this all happened. That was a Democratic president who did this, so nobody is everybody's vulnerable to racist panic in the moment, and then lots of anti-Japanese, really anti-Asian racist support of camping, of dumping all these people in camps. Here's some gross signs. I'm not going to read them. Stuff I don't want to say out loud, but it's the kind of stuff you see around America now from conservatives about trans people or immigrants or black people or even sometimes women. The stuff's still out there. But here it is in World War II. Which is not to say that everyone was shitty and racist. There were resistance movements like mostly all over California, the vast majority of Japanese Americans in America in 1942 lived in California. And some Californians said, that's not cool. I've got a really great book on my bookshelf about a town up in Central California where the white farmers all agreed to farm the Japanese farms while they were gone and to keep them running and to pay their bills so that when the Japanese American farmers got out of the camps, their farms were still there. It's a fantastic book. It's called Farming of the Home Place by Valerie Matsumoto, who's a UCLA history professor. Um, but so it's not like everybody turned anti-Asian racist assholes, but enough people to put 100,000 people in camps for no reason. Okay, it wasn't 100,000, it was 127,000. See? Even I don't like the numbers. Again, I don't expect you to memorize any of these things. I will in no time ask you to regurgitate numbers or dates. I just want you to get a sense of the scale of the thing. I love that picture. It's both beautiful and sad. Oh my God. Anyway, I don't need to interpret the picture for you. 47,000 first generation Japanese immigrants. Well, they weren't allowed to become citizens. So I forgot about that. They weren't allowed to become citizens. And they weren't allowed to own property. And so, like, if you were born in Japan and you came to the United States, it didn't matter. You could never become a citizen, and then you weren't allowed to own property. So what people would do is they would have a baby, and then the baby, put your rabbit ear air quotes around that, would buy the house or the farm or the store. I keep saying farms because a lot of Japanese Americans were farmers, because that's what they did in Japan. And then 80,000 second generation, so that's my parents were immigrants, but I was born here, or third generation, which means my grandparents were immigrants, but I was born here, for a grand total of 127,000 Japanese Americans, and I'm going to call even the first generation, that 47,000, I'm going to call them Japanese Americans because they volunteered to come here, they lived here, they worked here, they had children who were Americans. As far as I'm concerned, they were Americans. Everybody gets to be an American. In my book, even the undocumented immigrants. But then again, I'm a hippie liberal. Anyway, 127,000 Japanese Americans rounded up, put in camps for the duration of the war for the crime of being Japanese Americans. Now, this is another one of the lectures that has two parts. I know exactly why this has two parts, because I used to do this in 2 different weeks. I would do one part and one the other week, because I had all these in-class activities we did that we don't get to do in an online class. But that's okay. We have many advantages in an online class. But anyway, so endeth part 1 of the World War II lecture. I shall see you in part 2, where we will talk about propaganda and comic books and some other fun stuff. Yeah, cool. All right, see you there.